Maid's daughter whispered in perfect German about a fake item. The deal collapsed. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's incredible story. The Vance family mansion was filled with the usual opulence, gold trim, crystal chandeliers, and an air of affluence that oozed from every corner. The floors, covered in imported marble, reflected the polished perfection of the empire that Callahan Vance had built. As one of the wealthiest men in the country, Callahan was accustomed to making deals that moved the world. Today, however, was different. Today, the stakes were even higher. A multi-million-dollar contract was on the table, one that would give him control over an entire tech company, expanding his reach into industries he had never even thought of before. The conference room was filled with high-powered investors, each one eager to get in on the action. The deal had been in the works for months, but there was just one last hurdle. A small, seemingly insignificant detail about the authenticity of one of the key products. A product that had been brought in to be part of the deal, an antique sculpture that had been appraised at millions. No one knew it was fake, not even Callahan himself. At the far side of the room, standing out like a ghost in the midst of so much wealth and power, was a small figure. Her name was Clementine, the 10-year-old daughter of the maid who worked in the Vance household. She wasn't supposed to be here. In fact, she wasn't supposed to even be noticed. Her mother had instructed her to stay in the corner, out of the way, and quiet. But Clementine had learned early in life to observe. Her mother's job depended on her ability to remain invisible, and Clementine had mastered that skill well. But today, she couldn't ignore what she had overheard. While everyone was distracted by the buzz of the deal, Clementine had been standing in the corner of the room, watching. She had never been interested in the business of adults, but today was different. As she gazed at the antique sculpture resting on the table, something felt off. It wasn't the way it looked, it was the way it felt. Her sharp eyes noticed the faint imperfections in the carvings, something that no one else seemed to catch. Her grandmother, who was a historian, had taught her to spot the smallest details, to never trust appearances. And today, Clementine's instincts screamed that this object wasn't real. As the deal was about to be finalized, the room went silent. Callahan was about to sign when Clementine, in a soft, calm voice, spoke up. "That's a fake," she whispered in perfect German, the words cutting through the silence like a knife. "That item is not genuine." The room froze. The investors, who had been so sure of the deal, turned their heads toward her, stunned by the sudden interruption. Callahan, who had seen her as nothing more than a child to be ignored, now found himself facing a challenge he hadn't anticipated. His face went pale as he turned to the sculpture and examined it closely, realizing that Clementine was right. The deal, one that had been months in the making, collapsed right before his eyes, all because of a child's keen eye and a whispered warning in a language no one had expected. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment that would change the way Callahan viewed not only the people around him, but the world he had built. He had underestimated the most unlikely of sources, Clementine, the quiet, invisible maid's daughter, who had just brought down an empire with a simple, truthful observation. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone processed what had just happened. Callahan Vance stood frozen, his pen hovering above the contract that was supposed to seal the biggest deal of his career. The investors stared, their faces a mix of disbelief and shock. They had just witnessed the collapse of a multi-million-dollar transaction, not because of a mistake by his team, but because of the quiet, seemingly invisible daughter of the maid. Clementine, the little girl who had been told to stay out of sight, had just brought down everything Callahan had worked so hard for with a single sentence in perfect German. As the room slowly started to murmur, Callahan's mind raced. He could feel his pride slipping away as he realized the enormity of the situation. He had not just lost a deal. He had lost control, and it was all because of a child he had dismissed as inconsequential. His gaze shifted from the fake item on the table to Clementine, who was standing by the wall, her small frame barely noticeable against the backdrop of polished marble and crystal. For the first time that day, Callahan saw her not as the maid's daughter, but as someone who had just upended everything he held dear. She had disrupted his world with nothing but a whisper. The investors, still in a state of shock, began to murmur among themselves. Some were confused, others were angry. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy blue suit, stood up and addressed Callahan. "How could you let this happen?" she demanded. "How could you not have verified the authenticity of such an important item?" Callahan's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. He had no defense. He had trusted the appraisers, he had trusted his team, and he had trusted the deal. But now, all of that was crumbling before him. "Maybe we should call the police," another investor suggested, his voice laced with frustration. "This is fraud." Callahan shook his head slowly, his mind still spinning. He had to regain control, but how? How could he fix something that had fallen apart so suddenly, so completely? As the tension in the room grew, Clementine remained quiet, her eyes downcast. She was standing by the window, staring out at the view, her small fingers gently brushing the hem of her dress. It was as if she was not fully aware of the impact of her actions. Or maybe, just maybe, she had known all along what she was doing. Callahan cleared his throat and, in a voice that sounded foreign to him, said, "We need to verify everything, immediately. We can't let this go on any longer." He turned to one of his assistants. "Get in touch with the experts. Have them come here right away. We need answers." As his team scrambled to take action, Callahan's mind continued to race. The deal was ruined, and there was no going back. But the damage had been done, and there was only one person in the room who had the clarity and courage to speak the truth. He found his gaze drawn back to Clementine. She had done something no one else had been able to do. She had stopped the deal, she had stopped the lie. And yet, despite everything, no one seemed to fully appreciate what had just happened. No one except for Callahan. He took a deep breath and walked over to her. His footsteps echoed in the quiet room as he approached her, feeling an odd mixture of gratitude and shame. He bent down slightly, meeting her gaze. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Clementine looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. She didn't smile, but there was a flicker of understanding in her expression. "You're welcome," she whispered, her voice calm. Callahan stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. He had always prided himself on being in control, but right now, he was at the mercy of a child's honesty. He stood, watching her, as the room behind them slowly returned to its chaotic state, knowing that the path ahead would be far more difficult than any deal he had ever made. The room was still buzzing with activity as the aftermath of the failed deal began to unfold. Callahan Vance stood at the window, looking out over the city that seemed so small from this height. The chaos in the conference room below, with frustrated investors and panicked assistants, felt distant. His mind was racing, but there was one thought that kept repeating. How could a child, someone who had no place in this world of business and power, have exposed the truth when his entire empire had failed to see it? Clementine, the maid's daughter, had been the one to stop the deal, to stop the lie. But that was not the only thing that had changed that day. Callahan's entire perspective was shifting. For the first time in years, he was questioning everything. His empire, his success, the very foundation on which his wealth had been built, suddenly felt fragile. Was it all based on deception, on things he had turned a blind eye to? He turned away from the window and glanced over at Clementine, still standing quietly in the corner of the room. The other investors had already started to leave, grumbling and muttering about the failed deal, but Callahan couldn't take his eyes off her. She was so small, so unassuming, and yet she had managed to see what no one else could. "Thank you," Callahan said again, his voice more sincere this time. Clementine nodded without saying a word, but there was something in her eyes that spoke volumes. She wasn't interested in thanks. She wasn't interested in recognition. She had simply done what she knew was right. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Clementine whispered, as if reading his thoughts. Callahan shook his head, stepping closer. "You didn't cause trouble. You saved me from making a huge mistake." He paused, the weight of her words settling over him. "You saved us all." The words were simple, but they carried a weight he hadn't expected. He was used to being the one in control, the one making the decisions. But here, in this moment, he was humbled by a child. It was a realization that both stung and enlightened him. Clementine didn't need the validation that most adults sought. She didn't need to prove herself or demand recognition. She had done what was right, without any expectation of reward. It was a purity of action that Callahan had long since lost in the midst of his power and wealth. For the first time, he began to question the values that had shaped his life. As the afternoon wore on, Callahan found himself thinking about Clementine and her quiet wisdom. He had lived a life where success was measured by money, by control, and by the ability to dominate. But what had that really brought him? A failed deal, a lost opportunity, and an aching emptiness that he couldn't ignore anymore. He looked back at Clementine, still standing near the window, her small frame barely noticeable against the grandeur of the room. She was waiting for him to say something more, but he didn't know what else to say. There was nothing left to be said. The truth had already been revealed. And in that moment, Callahan realized that the real deal he needed to make wasn't with investors or clients. It was with himself. He needed to change. He needed to see the world through different eyes. It was a slow process, but it was beginning. Clementine had given him the catalyst for that change. As he walked out of the room, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The world he had built was crumbling, but in its place, something new was beginning to grow. The next few days were a whirlwind for Callahan Vance. The fallout from the failed deal had reverberated throughout his entire business empire, shaking it to its core. He spent hours in meetings, fielding calls from irate investors and clients, trying to salvage what little remained of the deal that had collapsed so spectacularly. But despite the chaos, one thought continued to occupy his mind: Clementine. The maid's daughter had exposed the truth about the fake item with nothing more than a few simple words. She had spoken in perfect German, pointing out the flaw that no one else had seen, and in doing so, she had stopped a catastrophe. The more Callahan thought about it, the more he realized that her action wasn't just a fluke. It was a lesson in honesty, in seeing through the surface, and in standing up for what's right, even when it's the hardest thing to do. It was something he had lost sight of in his pursuit of wealth and power. Clementine had shown him a side of life he had long neglected, the value of integrity over success, of truth over profits. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of dealing with the aftermath, Callahan decided to do something he never thought he would do. He walked down the long corridor of his mansion to the small room where Clementine had been staying with her mother. As he approached the door, he hesitated, unsure of what to say or how to start. He knocked softly, and a moment later, the door creaked open. There stood Clementine, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same dress she had worn the day she exposed the deal. Her eyes were steady, not afraid or nervous, but calm, almost as if she knew this moment would come. "Clementine," Callahan began, his voice soft, "I owe you an apology." She looked up at him, and for a brief second, he saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes. But she said nothing. "I want to thank you," he continued. "What you did, it was something I would never have expected from someone like you. But you saved me. You saved all of us." Clementine remained silent for a moment, her gaze steady, as if processing his words. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said quietly. "I did it because it was wrong." Callahan nodded, his chest tightening at the simplicity of her words. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And that's what makes it so powerful." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I've spent so much of my life focused on making deals, on winning, on becoming more powerful, that I forgot what really matters. I forgot that the truth is more important than any deal." Clementine didn't respond, but her expression softened, and for the first time, Callahan felt like he was truly seeing her. Not as the maid's daughter, not as the quiet child who had been pushed to the margins of society, but as someone with more integrity and wisdom than anyone else in the room. "I want to make things right," he said finally, his voice steady. "Not just with the deal, but with everything. I've been blind, Clementine. You showed me that." She nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It's okay," she said, her voice gentle. "I think you'll do better now." Callahan stood there for a moment, taking in her words. He wasn't sure how, but he knew that everything had changed. It wasn't about fixing the deal anymore. It wasn't about proving himself to others or restoring his empire. It was about restoring his own sense of honor and truth. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. As he turned to leave, Clementine called after him. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice firm but kind, "you don't have to be perfect. You just have to do the right thing." Callahan smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "Thank you, Clementine," he said, the words carrying more weight than he had ever intended. As he walked down the hallway, he realized that the lesson she had taught him was one he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Days passed after that pivotal conversation, and Callahan Vance felt a shift deep within himself. The chaos from the collapsed deal had settled, but something else had begun to stir, a change in how he saw the world and the people around him. The investors who once revered him for his wealth and power now watched him with a mixture of confusion and skepticism. They had all expected him to sweep in, fix the deal, and regain his reputation. But Callahan was no longer focused on regaining his empire. He was focused on something far more important, restoring his own sense of integrity. It wasn't an easy transition. The temptation to return to his old ways, to climb back to the top through manipulation and deceit, was always there. But every time Callahan thought about it, Clementine's face came to mind. Her quiet wisdom, the way she had stood firm in the truth, without expecting anything in return, had shaken him to his core. It was clear that the deal had been the catalyst for something much bigger in his life. He could not go back. He could not continue down the path he had been on. The truth had been revealed, and he had to face it. He began making small changes in his life. Instead of focusing on his wealth and power, he started paying attention to the people around him, to their stories, their struggles, and their values. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about being a better person, someone who didn't need to hide behind his fortune and status. As the days turned into weeks, Callahan started to repair the damage that had been done to his reputation, but not in the way people expected. He reached out to the people who had been affected by the collapse of the deal, the ones who had lost money, the ones who had been betrayed. He didn't promise them millions or offer them a way back to their former lives. Instead, he apologized. And he meant it. He didn't just apologize to the investors or his business partners. He apologized to his employees, the ones who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, who had seen the cracks in his empire before anyone else did. He thanked them for their loyalty and promised to do better. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Callahan felt like giving up, moments when he wanted to revert to his old ways. But every time he felt weak, he thought about Clementine. She had shown him what true integrity looked like, and he couldn't undo the lesson she had taught him. One afternoon, Callahan walked into the small room where Clementine had been staying with her mother. It had been a while since he had spoken to her, and he wanted to thank her once again, not just for what she had done, but for the change she had sparked in him. When he knocked on the door, her mother answered, and after a brief exchange, Callahan stepped inside. Clementine was sitting at the small table by the window, reading a book. She looked up when he entered, and for a brief moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. Callahan sat down across from her. "Clementine," he began, his voice sincere, "I want to thank you again. I know I've said it before, but I want you to know that what you did has changed my life." Clementine nodded, her expression soft. "You did the right thing," she said simply. "That's all that matters." Callahan smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He was finally on the right path. The road ahead wasn't easy, and he knew there would be challenges along the way. But he had learned something priceless: the power of honesty, the value of integrity, and the importance of doing what's right, no matter the cost. As he left the room, he felt a quiet sense of gratitude for Clementine, for showing him that sometimes the smallest voices have the power to change the world. Weeks passed, and Callahan Vance began to feel the weight of his newfound awareness. The changes he had made in his life were small but significant, and every day brought new challenges as he worked to rebuild not just his business but his character. The old habits were hard to shake, and the world around him didn't always welcome the changes he was trying to make. His investors, once eager to partner with him, were now cautious. They questioned his decisions and his ability to lead with integrity. Some of them began to pull back, unwilling to take risks on someone who had shown weakness. But Callahan knew that his journey wasn't about pleasing them anymore. It was about doing the right thing, even if it cost him everything. He spent long hours meeting with the people who had been affected by the deal. He spoke with employees who had seen the cracks in his empire long before he had, and apologized for overlooking them. He thanked them for their loyalty and made promises to support them even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. It wasn't easy, and there were days when Callahan wondered if he was making a mistake. But each time he felt doubt creeping in, he remembered Clementine. Her quiet strength, her unshakable honesty, had changed the way he saw the world. She had shown him that true power didn't lie in wealth or control, but in the courage to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. One evening, as the sun began to set, Callahan stood on the balcony of his mansion, looking out over the city. He had just finished a meeting with a group of investors who were still hesitant to trust him. The deal was still on the table, but it felt different now. He wasn't pursuing it for the glory or the money. He was pursuing it to prove to himself that he could rebuild what had been broken. As he stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Clementine's mother. "Clementine would like to speak with you," it read. Callahan hesitated for a moment. It had been a while since he had spoken to her, and he wondered if she had been following his progress. With a deep breath, he typed a quick reply. "I'll be there in an hour." An hour later, he found himself back in the small room where Clementine had once quietly changed his life. The room was simple, with a small bed and a desk, but it was filled with a sense of peace that Callahan had never known in his own mansion. Clementine was sitting at the desk, reading a book. She looked up when he entered, her eyes soft, not full of expectation, but with the quiet understanding that had always marked her presence. "Hello, Mr. Vance," she said. "How are you?" Callahan smiled, a little surprised by the warmth in her voice. "I'm doing better," he said. "Still a long way to go, but I'm getting there." Clementine nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "I knew you would," she said quietly. Callahan took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of the changes he had made. "I wanted to thank you, Clementine," he said, his voice sincere. "I've been trying to do better, trying to be a better man, and I couldn't have done it without you." Clementine looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You didn't need me to tell you what was right," she said. "You just needed to see it for yourself." Callahan nodded slowly. "You're right. But you gave me the clarity I needed. You opened my eyes to what really matters." He paused, as if considering something important. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to make things right, not just with my business, but with the people who've been affected by my actions." Clementine smiled softly, as if she already knew what he was thinking. "You're on the right path," she said. "Keep going." Callahan stood there for a moment, taking in her words. He had spent so much of his life focused on the wrong things: power, wealth, success. But now, for the first time, he understood that the true measure of success wasn't in what he could achieve for himself, but in how he treated others, in the choices he made when no one was watching. He looked out the window, feeling the weight of his journey and the hope for the future. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way, but for the first time, Callahan felt like he was on the right path. The path that Clementine had shown him. The path of truth, of honesty, and of integrity. Months went by, and the changes Callahan Vance had begun to make in his life were slowly starting to take shape. He had transformed from a businessman driven solely by wealth and power into someone who was learning to value honesty, integrity, and the importance of making things right. His empire, once dominated by ruthless deals and questionable actions, was now being rebuilt on a foundation of transparency and accountability. But the journey wasn't easy. Many of the investors who had once supported him remained skeptical of his new direction, and some even distanced themselves, unwilling to take a risk on someone they viewed as unreliable. Callahan understood their concerns. After all, he had built his empire on a shaky foundation, and it was difficult to prove that he had truly changed. But he wasn't in it for the investors or the money anymore. He was in it for himself. He had finally realized that no amount of success or wealth could replace the feeling of knowing you had done the right thing. His first major test came when a new deal, one that had the potential to make or break his reputation, was presented to him. The deal was worth millions of dollars, and it involved acquiring a tech company that had been on the verge of bankruptcy. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. It would expand his business into an entirely new market, and he would be able to show the world that his company was still thriving. But as Callahan dug deeper into the details of the deal, he found something troubling. The company's financials had been manipulated. It wasn't an isolated incident. The more he looked into it, the more he realized that the deal was built on lies. It was exactly the kind of deal he used to pursue: quick, profitable, and deceptive. But this time, something was different. This time, Callahan wasn't willing to ignore the truth. He could feel Clementine's words echoing in his mind. You just need to see it for yourself. He didn't need anyone else to tell him what was right or wrong. He knew now that the right choice was to walk away from the deal, no matter how much money was at stake. He called his team into the conference room and presented his findings. The room was filled with tension as Callahan explained that the deal, despite its potential, was not worth pursuing. He was met with resistance. Several of his senior executives, the ones who had been with him for years, argued that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They urged him to go forward with the deal to secure the future of the company. But Callahan stood firm. We're not doing it, he said, his voice steady. I won't sacrifice our integrity for profit. The room went silent. For the first time in a long while, Callahan could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. His team was shocked, some disappointed, others frustrated. But deep down, Callahan knew it was the right decision. The right decision for his company and for himself. The days that followed were filled with more difficult conversations and decisions. Some of his business partners walked away, unwilling to follow his new path. Others were supportive, seeing the value in his newfound integrity. Slowly, Callahan rebuilt his reputation, not by chasing after the biggest deals or the quickest profits, but by focusing on the people he had let down and making amends. He reached out to those he had wronged in the past, offering apologies and finding ways to make things right. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Clementine, though still quiet and humble, had become a constant presence in Callahan's life. She had shown him a world where honesty and doing the right thing mattered more than wealth and status. And it was a world he was beginning to build for himself. It wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, and for the first time in years, Callahan felt like he was on the right track. As he stood in the conference room, looking out over the city, he knew that the empire he was rebuilding would be different. It would be built on truth, and that was more valuable than anything money could buy. As months turned into a year, Callahan Vance continued his journey of change. He had embraced a new way of doing business, focusing on honesty, transparency, and rebuilding the relationships he had once neglected. His reputation, though still healing, had started to shift in a positive direction. However, the journey had not been without its challenges. Many of the investors who had stood by him in the past were still hesitant to fully trust his new approach. Some were waiting for him to slip, to return to the cutthroat businessman they once knew. But Callahan was determined not to disappoint them. He knew that the road to redemption was long, and the price of honesty was sometimes higher than expected. One evening, Callahan stood at the edge of his office balcony, gazing out over the city. The skyline, once a symbol of his empire's power, now seemed like a distant reminder of who he used to be. The empire was still there, but it felt different now, lighter somehow. The heavy weight of his past decisions no longer pressed down on him as it once did. He had learned to let go of the need for control and the obsession with dominance. He had learned to listen to the voices that mattered, not just the ones with the most money or the loudest voices, but the quiet ones that spoke truth. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his office door. It was his assistant, holding a message. "Mr. Vance," she said, "there's someone here to see you." Callahan raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "It's Clementine," she replied. "She asked if she could speak with you." Callahan's heart skipped a beat. It had been a while since he had last spoken to her. He had kept in touch with her mother, but Clementine had remained quiet, focusing on her schoolwork and her life outside the world of business. He stood up, motioning for his assistant to let her in. Moments later, Clementine entered the room, her usual calm presence filling the space. She was no longer the quiet girl from before. There was a maturity in her step, a quiet confidence that had been cultivated over the past year. She was still the same, yet somehow different. "Clementine," Callahan said, offering a warm smile. "It's good to see you." She smiled back, but there was something more in her eyes, something thoughtful, as though she had something important to say. "I've been watching what you've been doing," she said, her voice steady. "And I think you're really trying to change. I can see it." Callahan nodded, grateful for her words. "It hasn't been easy," he admitted. "But I'm learning, and I'm trying to make up for the mistakes I've made." Clementine's eyes softened. "I think you're doing well. It's not about being perfect, you know. It's about making the right choices, even when it's hard." Callahan's heart swelled with pride at her wisdom. She was right. It wasn't about being flawless, it was about showing up every day and doing better than the day before. Thank you, he said quietly. I don't think I could have done it without you, Clementine. You opened my eyes to what really matters. You taught me that power isn't about control. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. Clementine looked down for a moment, as if considering his words. When she looked back up, there was a small, knowing smile on her face. You don't have to thank me, she said. I just showed you what was already inside of you. You were always capable of making the right choice. You just needed to see it. Callahan smiled, the weight of his past decisions no longer feeling so heavy. He knew that the road ahead was still uncertain, that there would be more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. He was no longer running from his past. He was embracing it, learning from it, and using it to build something better. I guess I've learned the hard way, Callahan said with a chuckle. But I'm finally learning. Clementine nodded, her gaze thoughtful. That's all anyone can do. As she stood to leave, Callahan watched her, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. She had been the catalyst for his change, the one who had forced him to face the truth. And now, it was up to him to continue on the path she had set him on. He had learned that the most important thing in life wasn't success or wealth, but integrity and the courage to do what was right. And with that lesson, Callahan knew he was ready for whatever the future held. As the weeks passed, Callahan Vance felt a quiet transformation within himself. The changes he had set in motion were becoming part of his daily life, and though the road had been difficult, he was finally beginning to see the fruits of his labor. The investors who had doubted him before began to notice his commitment to doing business differently. Slowly, trust was being restored, but it wasn't about winning back his wealth or status. It was about reclaiming his peace of mind. The journey had taken him to unexpected places. He had rebuilt his empire, but it wasn't the empire he once knew. This one was grounded in truth, with integrity at its core. The hollow, relentless pursuit of power had been replaced by a desire to build something lasting, something that could stand the test of time. Callahan sat in his office one afternoon, staring out the window at the city below. The hustle and bustle of the world outside seemed so distant now, as if he was finally at peace with himself. His empire was still vast, but it felt different now. It felt lighter, less burdened by the weight of ambition and greed. He had learned that success was not just measured by the size of his bank account or the power he wielded, but by the relationships he had built and the impact he had on the lives of others. As he leaned back in his chair, there was a knock at the door. It was his assistant, holding a message. Mr. Vance, there's someone here to see you. Callahan raised an eyebrow, curious. Who is it? It's Clementine, she replied. His heart skipped a beat. It had been months since he last saw her, but her influence on him had never waned. Send her in, he said, standing up. Moments later, Clementine entered the room, looking as poised as ever. She had grown, both physically and emotionally, but there was still the same quiet strength about her that Callahan had come to admire. She wasn't the same girl who had exposed the fake deal, but she was still the same person who had changed his life. Clementine, he greeted her warmly. It's good to see you. She smiled, a small but genuine smile, and took a seat across from him. I wanted to check in, she said softly. I've been following what you've been doing. I see the changes you've made. Callahan nodded. It's been a journey, he said. A difficult one, but I'm getting there. Clementine's gaze softened. I always knew you had it in you, she said. It wasn't about me. You just needed to see the truth for yourself. Callahan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, he said sincerely. You showed me that the truth is more important than any deal, any profit. Clementine nodded, her eyes full of understanding. It's not about being perfect, Callahan. It's about doing what's right. Every day. Callahan stood up, walking over to the window. I've spent my life trying to fix things, trying to make everything perfect, he said. But I've learned that the most important thing is to keep moving forward, to learn from the past, and do better in the future. Clementine stood as well, walking over to him. And that's all anyone can do, she said. Callahan turned to face her, a sense of peace settling over him. Thank you, he said quietly. For everything. Clementine smiled, her eyes bright. You did it yourself, she said softly. I just showed you the way. As Callahan watched her leave, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons she had taught him. She had shown him that the path to success was not about conquering the world, but about finding the courage to face the truth, to make things right, and to build something that mattered. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more challenges to face. But Callahan was no longer afraid. He had learned that the greatest success was not measured by wealth, but by the strength of one's character and the ability to do good in the world. And with that knowledge, he was ready for whatever the future held. In this captivating millionaire story, follow the journey of Callahan Vance, a once successful businessman who built his empire on power and wealth, only to have it all come crashing down when his world is exposed by an unlikely source. A young girl, Clementine, the maid's daughter, steps in and reveals the truth, shifting Callahan's life forever. As this millionaire story unfolds, watch Callahan learn invaluable lessons about integrity, accountability, and the true meaning of success. His journey leads him to question everything he once believed about business and life, forcing him to rebuild his empire based on honesty and transparency. As he faces the consequences of his past actions, he finds himself in a battle between wealth and doing what's right. This millionaire story is more than just about money. It's about the importance of personal growth and the courage to change. Will Callahan overcome his past mistakes and reclaim his future? Dive into this inspiring millionaire story and discover how a simple act of truth can reshape everything. If you're looking for a gripping tale of personal transformation and millionaire success, this story will leave you inspired and motivated to chase integrity above all else. Watch as Callahan's life is completely turned around, showing that even the richest can learn the most valuable lessons from those they least expect. This is not just another millionaire story. It's the story of redemption, growth, and finding the true meaning of success. Don't miss this unforgettable millionaire story that proves how one decision can change everything.